Of the many things I love about Go the Second Mile, one of them is the name. And I'd like to offer a few reflections on why this idea of going the second mile I think is important. And I think it really starts because of, did we lose something back there? Okay, we're having a technical difficulty. But it has something to do with encountering the other. Our world is probably as divided as it's ever been in many ways between us and the other. And right now, we're not willing to go the first mile to encounter the other. And in fact, our preference, I think, would be that the other just didn't exist. When you decide you wish the other didn't exist, that leads to something that's happened a number of times in history. It's called ethnic cleansing, because the other becomes like a pollution or a cancer, or they've been called cockroaches and all kinds of other names, where we dehumanize the other. And by dehumanizing the other is easier to get rid of. And so when I think about why go the second mile, I think the first answer is because you have to encounter the other. That's what happened to Diane and Lee in some of their travels. By the way, this is my desktop, which is great. You get to see my family of about a year ago. And it was very nice because all of my 100,000 files didn't show up in that thing. Having your desktop go up is like standing in front of people in your underwear or something. It's not a good thing. I'm not getting any, something's not working there. Let's try. There we go. But the idea of traveling somewhere else so that you can have an encounter with the other on the turf of the other is phenomenally important. When you encounter the other on their turf, you are changed and they are changed. You're no longer one and the other. You're transformed into a one another. It's a pretty amazing word, one another. It doesn't suggest that the other is absorbed into us. One of the words we often use, it's a good word, I'm not against it at all, but the word inclusion very often has the idea of get rid of the otherness of the other, make him one of us or her one of us. But one another isn't the same as inclusion. One another says you retain your differentness and I retain my differentness, but we create a new unit that includes our differentness. I was in East Africa in a place, in fact, if you look at the photographs on the Second Mile website, you'll see some of the people I'm about to talk about. But I was at a gathering. It was a gathering of young Christian leaders in East Africa, in Bujumbura, Burundi. And most of the people in the audience were of the two dominant tribes of that region. You know about these tribes from the movie Hotel Rwanda, the Tutsi and the Hutu. And but the organizer of the event made a bold move. He invited the local indigenous group. It's fascinating how around the world there have been waves of colonization, and the most marginalized people tend to be the indigenous people who get displaced by waves of colonization. Well, before white colonizers came, and if you think of Africa like this, Bantu colonizers from West Africa and Nilotic colonizers from North Africa had converged on the area, cut down all the trees for farms, and so the hunter-gatherer peoples who lived in the forest had been landless for 600 years. They're called the Twa. The Twa people, or in their language, Ba Twa just means people Twa. We call them the Pygmies, but they invited 3 Batwa people to the event. And I didn't realize how unprecedented that was. But in fact, it was a group about this size, and I remember at one point, one of the Batwa fellows named Etienne spoke up. And of course, I didn't understand what he was saying because it was in the local language. But when he got about 2 sentences out of his mouth, everyone in the room laughed hysterically. And he didn't smile. He wasn't telling a joke. And maybe 20 minutes later, he said something else. Everybody laughed again. And I think that happened 3 or 4 times. And during the break, I walked up to him. Now, I don't speak Kirundi, but I do speak very bad French. And so he spoke good French, and I went up to him and I said in French, I noticed that when you spoke, everyone laughed. I said, did this hurt your feelings? And he said, this happens all the time. He explained, I'm of a different tribe. And he said, we normally are not invited to events like this. I was just happy to be invited. What a gracious response. Well, I went up to one of the other participants. It was a woman who happened to be Tutsi who spoke good English. And I wasn't condemning her. I just said, I noticed that whenever that fellow over there spoke, everybody laughed. She said, wasn't that amazing? She said, I never heard one of those people speak before. She said, we didn't really know they could talk like us, but they do have a funny accent, don't they? And there was no malice. It was just the encounter with otherness, you see. And she told me some of the things that Tutsi and Hutu people think about the Twa people. Well, one of the things she told me is that there's a saying. If it rains and you seek shelter in a Twa hut, you might as well never leave. Now, what that means is you've become polluted. You've become like one of them. You have become the other by entering their hut. So you might as well just stay with them. You're ruined forever. But because of those 4 days of that conference, the one and the other began to interact. And on the last day of the conference, that woman who had told me those things, I found out about this later, went up to one of the other Twa men and said to him, this is quite breaking protocol for a woman to say this to a man. Forget about the tribal issues. She said, I wondered if I could come visit you at your apartment sometime. And it was her way of saying through those days, now, I have experienced you no longer as the other. I've experienced you as a one another. That's one of the things that Second Mile does. And not only it happens for the people who go and experience it, but then when they come back and tell the stories about it to people like all the rest of us, then we start to see, there's something going on here. Another reason I think this encounter, why, even though it's expensive, and believe me, I travel a lot, if you all think that travel is glamorous, you will reach your lifetime limit very quickly. And you think about having to go on another trip, and you don't think, oh, great, more airplane food, I can't wait for security again. That won't happen. But another reason why it's worth it is because when you go to visit the other on the turf of the other, and you actually live with them, you don't just attend a lecture with them, you sleep in their home, you eat their food, you meet their family members, you walk their streets. When you live with the other, you become companions. Of course, that word, kompan, with bread. You have bread with them. And something happens when you have bread with people. One of the worst slums I've ever been in is outside of Mexico City. I've been in slums all over the world, but one of the worst is outside of Mexico City. Incredibly fast-growing slums. If you've ever been to Mexico City, it has about a perfect climate. Not the best air, but a very perfect climate. And there are jobs, and so people come from all over, and the slums just grow and grow and grow. And when I stayed in the home of a family in the slum, it had already been improved. It started as a corrugated tin and plywood shack, but the longer they stayed, they would be riding their bicycle somewhere and find a cinder block and put the cinder block on the back of their bicycle, and a few weeks later find something else. And eventually they built a decent place. And I'll just never forget getting to their home. I was walking basically through sewage. And to sleep on a little couch in their house and hear the sounds at night and wake up to all the roosters. Who knew there could be that many roosters, in high-density population, and to eat at their table and experience their hospitality. Something happens when you live with people that goes beyond studying them or watching a documentary about them, or even meeting them on neutral territory. To live with people. There's a beautiful word for this. It's the word conviviality. It's something that we're losing. Something that in the West, our whole search for affluence, in some ways we want to avoid conviviality. We want to live with ourselves and our kind, but not with the other. It's one of the reasons something like Second Mile is really important, to get people to go and experience and build companionship with the other. Another reason I think it really matters to build this kind of second mile mindset of inconveniencing ourselves, but to go and build relationships, not just to fix people and not just to help people, but actually to know people. When I was talking to Diane and Lee just today, one of the things they were saying is, boy, one of our incredible experiences is to be with people and hear their stories and talk with them, to converse with them, not to preach to them. There's been an awful lot of that under the term missions, where there's no listening. But conversing involves speaking, but it also involves listening. It involves asking, and it involves answering. And it's an amazing thing that happens when people encounter one another and it becomes safe to ask questions. I was with a Cambodian man once who was illiterate in his first language. His name was Tum. But Tum was beginning to learn a little bit of English, and he wanted to practice his English with me. And he'd been through the whole thing with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge regime. He'd been through incredible atrocities. And he showed me, after we got to know each other a little bit better, he showed me his arm was just covered. He'd been hacked with a machete. And he said, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, but this was an act of respect on his part. He called me Ticha. Ticha, what this? I said, oh, Tom, that's a scar. And of course, the little letter R is hard for almost everybody in every language. Oh, ska. And I said, close enough. And then I realized why. I thought, why did he want to know that? And then he reached over and pointed to my chin. And he said, Ticha, ska? Because I have a cleft chin, and Cambodians don't have a cleft chin. And I realized all the time he'd been seeing me, the poor guy had just wondered, what happened to that poor man, that he got a chin that looks like a butt, But when we converse with the other, we hear their stories, they hear our stories, their voice becomes resident inside of us. We remember the sound of their voice. Their voice, their vocalization gets stuck inside of us. And for the rest of our lives, we become their advocate. We can't help when we speak, but speak for them. This is why, among other things, in all the contentious issues, you think of contentious issues around sexuality. But people who know and love lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people and know what they've been through, their voice gets inside of you. And so when somebody makes a joke or insults someone, you say, hold it. Their voice is in me. I have to speak up. I have to advocate for them. When rich people say disgusting, stupid, ignorant things about poor people, they're lazy. You think about all the poor people you've met who live in a place. I was not across the sea. I was in inner city Baltimore a while back, and I was in a neighborhood there. A friend of mine, African-American pastor, has been working in this neighborhood for years. He said, yeah, they call it a jobs crisis when white people can't work. When 9% of white people can't find a job, it's a crisis. He said, in my neighborhood, it has never been below 18% unemployment. Worldwide, I think the worldwide unemployment rate is about 19%. I've been in places where there's less than 10% employment. And so when you hear people make insulting statements about poor people, and when you have gone the second mile to be with them on their turf and heard their stories, you've heard their voices, you have to advocate. And this is one of the reasons why, even though it's expensive, and even though it's difficult, and even though it's inconvenient, the act of going to listen. It's so interesting. I come from a Christian background. My grandfather was a missionary. He traveled across the ocean to preach to people. But now I often think that what we really need are missionaries who will go across the ocean to listen to people so that their stories can become, their voices can get into us and we can advocate for the other. Also, when we encounter the other, and we always experience their hospitality. Isn't it interesting? If those of you who know the New Testament, you know in one of the Gospels, in all the Gospels, Jesus sends his disciples out and tells them basically, go be freeloaders. You know, he says, don't take anything with you so that you will have to experience the hospitality of the other. It's so interesting. We always want to go in a paternalistic way to help people, but there's something that happens when you need help. Right after September 11th, I was involved in a big interfaith thing just outside of Washington, D.C., and it's a story too long and hilarious to tell you all the details of. But it involved the local mosque. The imam and I became very good friends, and he reached out to all the churches and synagogues in the area, and he said, everyone's afraid of us, so we want to invite you. He said, help us invite people to our mosque so they can see we're just human beings like everybody else. And so he invited all the ministers and rabbis to give a little 10-minute talk, and oh my gosh, they were the worst talks in the world. And I was last, and everyone was given 10 minutes, and they all went 20 or 30, and we all just kind of wanted the world to end so it'd all be over. It was unbelievable. And so I only, I was trying to be sensitive. What should I say? I just knew I should not take 10 minutes. Whatever I said, it should be like 2 minutes. So I threw away my prepared notes and shared what had happened to me a couple of days before on my day off. I like to fish. It's sort of a vice. My daughter is a vegan or vegetarian animal rights activist. She says, Dad, you're a nice guy. I don't know why you get pleasure out of the involuntary body piercing of small-scaled vertebrates. That's her line. But anyway, I was going to go fishing, and I have a little kayak, and I stuck it up on the roof of my car, and I was driving a little over an hour away to this nice river where I like to fish. And I could hear one of the straps on the kayak was fluttering. So I pulled off the highway, off an exit, and stopped my car and got out to tighten up the strap. But I didn't realize that when I shut the door, it locked and the car was running. And I was way out in the country, far away from anybody. And I'm thinking, I don't get that many days off, and I'm going to spend the entire day hitchhiking to a town, and my car will be out of gas, and I'm just thinking, this is unbelievable. So I start trudging toward the nearest town, which is a long way away, and I put up my thumb, and a ramshackle van pulls over, filled with a bunch of guys from India, Hindu guys. And they picked me up, and they drove me to the nearest town. And I went in and talked to them. I said, it's okay, I'll hitchhike back. They refused. They said they were going to wait for me to get the help that I needed. I made some phone calls and arranged to get somebody to come break into my car legally. And they drove me all the way back, and they wouldn't leave. And I finally persuaded them that I would be okay and I'd leave. And I experienced their amazing hospitality, of strangers. And so all I did that day is I just told my story about being the recipient of hospitality from people who were religiously the other. And when they picked me up at the side of the road, they never asked me if I was a Hindu or not. It was just enough that I was a human being. And so when we share hospitality, we experience becoming guests and hosts. And I don't know if you ever thought of this before, but the word host is related to the word hostel. Both the word hostel, T-E-L, is in youth hostel, and also the word hostel, I-L-E, as in hostility. And I think it works like this. The idea is that if somebody came to your door and you welcomed them in, they were your guest and you were the host. But if someone came to your door and you turned them away because you feared them and you thought they were hostile. So something happens when we forego hostility to the other and extend, by the way, this word is also related, hospitality to the other. We decide to relate to the other without fear, and instead by making space, by making room in our hearts, in our homes, at the dinner table, and in this case, in the back of a kind of a dirty van. Why do we go the second mile? When we encounter the other and we experience hospitality, it happens. You fall in love with a person. And what was strange and different and off-putting to you ends up suddenly becoming endearing and wonderful and beautiful to you. And you love this person. You love these people. And I know all the folks in Second Mile who have shown up in some pretty wild places, whether it's Peru or Tibet or Rwanda. You end up in places where total strangers soon, partly because you've gone to the trouble of walking the second mile to go visit them, the fact that you cared enough about them to come, suddenly now they love you and you love them, and they become brother, sister, daughter, son, father, mother, friend. The other becomes brother. The other becomes mother. They're part of your family. And in some strange way, the act of crossing the threshold of someone's home and going across the boundaries that we draw and entering into one another's space, we experience something that a lot of theologians talk a lot about, but we experience the fact that we're all part of the same creation. We're all children in the same big family. It's a pretty amazing thing. When you encounter the other, you start drawing lines. But not the kind of lines we're used to. Not the kind of lines where we draw lines between people. Democrat, Republican, African American, Hispanic, Caucasian. We draw a lot of those lines. Global North, Global South. In my mind, one of the stupidest lines ever. Developed world, undeveloped world, or developing world. Oh my gosh. Think about that one. But instead of drawing lines that separate people, we start drawing lines between people. And have you ever noticed this when you travel? You know, you're like, you meet someone who's from India, a rather large country. And what do you say? Do you happen to know? And you know one person out of, the billion people in India. But why do we do that? Because we're trying to establish a line of someone I know who you might know, because that gives us a line to one another. And it's one of the reasons why I think encountering the other is so important, because we start building all of these lines. The image that comes to my mind, it's a little bit graphic, but I think I can say it with some amount of sanitization. But you've had the experience of getting a bad scar. And you know that you get stitches or bandages or whatever, but little cells have to form, little threads of connection across the gap of the scar. And those little threads of connection are what eventually bind what has been torn asunder back together. And in some ways, groups like Second Mile are sending people across these different scars and these lines that have been lines of division, and they become lines of connection. And when you start building line after line after line of connection, of course, you're creating a network. And one of our great challenges in today's world is that we have people who are working harder to build walls than we have people who are working to build the lines of connection. People are working harder to build lines of division than build lines of connection. And so those of us who are upset about the lines of division, we just got to get busy building lines of connection. And you start to realize that without those lines of connection, the world can fall apart. Don't we feel this right now? Our government can fall apart. Our nation can come apart at the seams, so to speak. And at times like this, people have to build those lines of connection as never before. One more. Obviously, when we cross the street and go the second mile and go encounter people in their own turf, one of the things we try to do is we try to meet some needs. In one of my books, I told a story about a fellow I met in Washington, D.C., a taxi driver. And this taxi driver, African-American guy, didn't make a lot of money as a taxi driver. One time he happened to pick up a guy from Malawi. And his ride just said to him, being polite, well, you'll have to come to Malawi sometime. And this Washington, D.C. taxi driver said, oh, well, yeah, I doubt that'll ever happen, but it's nice of you to ask. And the guy said, no, I'm serious, and wrote his address down, and somehow they stayed in touch, and somehow some money came his way, and wouldn't you know it, he ends up going to Malawi. And he was a smart guy. He just had great instincts, probably instincts that a professional missiologist wouldn't have had. He got this idea. He knew that the kids there played soccer, so he bought a bunch of soccer balls and soccer uniforms. And his instinct was, probably the kids there are way too poor to ever have a uniform. If I brought a uniform, now you might think, boy, they need food, they need a lot of other things. But his instinct said, bring some uniforms. And he realized that would bring the kids dignity. And if the kids feel dignity, their parents feel something. And one thing led to another. Just crossing to meet some needs became a beautiful thing. But when we understand ourselves only to meet the needs of other people, we know that creates paternalism. It creates almost a dehumanization of the other. The whole relationship becomes a relationship of dependency and superiority. So interestingly, I think, and this is one of the things I love about Second Mile, and more people are realizing this. This is not about a one-way charity. It really is going from being counterparts to being partners. And it works in a couple of ways. First, it works because we acknowledge how much we gain when we encounter the other. I mean, I'd really have to say, some of the most meaningful things in my life have occurred in those experiences where ostensibly I was trying to help somebody else, but what I received was far better. I don't know how many times I've heard this. When I've been in Africa, for example, people say something like this: I came to Africa to save Africans. I found out I needed to save myself. And there's something that happens when we understand its mutuality. But it's not just that. I have a friend named Dottie who's a pastor, a Methodist pastor in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was at her church a couple of years ago. I can't remember the exact date, but it was right after the Haitian earthquake. Was that? Some of you remember the date. Anyhow, was it in December it happened? Or January it happened? So I was probably there in February. And Dottie is in a lot of trouble because they started a church service for homeless people. And it's right at the edge of a kind of a nice neighborhood. And the nice white people in this neighborhood don't like homeless people coming around. And so, and then to make matters worse, she started serving the Eucharist at the outdoor church service. But they had it, by the way, outdoors because a lot of the homeless folks don't really like coming inside. There's some issues, and so they have it outside. And being Phoenix, you can do that. And then they decided, gosh, these folks are hungry, so they would have a big potluck breakfast in association with this service, or brunch kind of a thing. Well, that gave the neighborhood people exactly the chance they needed, because then they accused Dottie of opening a restaurant without a permit. And so she was in all kinds of trouble last time I talked to her. And I was there in the middle of all this. And I got to attend the service that they do for the homeless folks in the area. And when I was there, Dottie got up and she said, I just want to let everybody know that last week we took an offering to send to the people of Haiti. And you people, just you people from our outdoor congregation, that's what she calls it, last week you gave $1,800 that we've already sent to help the people in Haiti. And at that moment there was a standing ovation and screaming and yelling, and people were so excited because nobody ever gives homeless people a chance to give to somebody else. And nobody acknowledges them as people who are dignified to give to others. And one of the beautiful things about Second Mile and other initiatives like this is that we're not getting people from outside to come do things for people on the inside. We're finding people on the inside who are doing things for one another, and then we're bringing resources to help and support. So we're developing a true partnership. And it goes in many, many different directions at once, and that's a very powerful thing. One last thing. I mean, there are many, many ways that this kind of going the second mile brings transformation to everybody involved. But as I said, our world is divided in rather scary ways these days. In every different country and in every religion, our kind versus the other kind. And this is what otherness is. It's when we go into the world always thinking, is he one of our kind or is he one of the other kind? One of the things I love about Second Mile is that Diane and Lee are doing what they're doing from their committed Christian faith. But there's lots of folks here from all different kinds of religious backgrounds, and I know that they would much rather have a whole range of people working together from many different religious backgrounds rather than just everybody saying, it's just our kind. Don't you all think that's a good thing? And when we cross these lines and go the second mile to cross these lines, and we get Christians and Muslims and Hindus and agnostics and atheists and Jews and Buddhists working together, and we cross our kind and the other kind, we start to remember that underneath all of these other differences is humankind. And that's what the ultimate kindness really is about. And that's one of the reasons I am so honored to be able to be here in support of Second Mile. Because the people involved, Kelly and Lee and Diane and others, and all of you for being here, are people who are trying to be part of a real movement of kindness in the world. For 24 years I was a pastor, and when I started as a pastor, I saw things very differently from when I ended as a pastor. And by the time when I left the pastorate about 5.5 years ago, I'd become very much convinced that there are 1,000 ways that religious people like me miss the point. In fact, I wrote a book called Adventures in Missing the Point. And I really came to believe that it really, at the end of the day, everything boils down to kindness. And I just want to read you a little poem kind of a thing. It's actually a song lyric that I wrote based on some words by St. Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body here on earth but ours, no hands, no feet on earth but ours. Ours are the eyes through which he looks on this world with kindness. Ours are the hands through which he works. Ours are the feet on which he moves. Ours are the voices through which he speaks to this world with kindness. Through our touch, our smile, our listening ear, embodied in us, Jesus is living here. So let us go now, filled with the Spirit, into this world with kindness. And you go the first mile and the second mile and the third mile with kindness, and that's what starts to make a difference. So thank you very much.